Before I get started, I'm going to speak from very briefly, about an hour or so, from three different texts. You might want to find them that kind of form a basis in a way for the other things that I'm going to say the rest of the sermon. Proverbs 11:2, Isaiah 61:7, Ephesians 5:12. Let me say those again so that if you didn't get them the first time, you'll get them the second time. Proverbs 11:2, Isaiah 61:7, Ephesians 5:12. A new pastor was visiting some of the homes in his parish, and he went to this one home and he knocked on the door and he rang the doorbell and nobody answered. But it was obvious somebody was home, the lights were on, there was noise inside the house and TVs were running and so forth. So he knocked again and nobody still answered. So he wrote on a little card, took that card out of his pocket, wrote on it Revelation 3:20, stuck it in the door and went on his way. Well, when Sunday came, he noticed that his card had come back to him in the offering plate, and someone had written on it a cryptic message, Genesis 3:10. So he got his Bible and opened it to the passage cited and began to laugh. You see, Revelation says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." Genesis 3:10 says, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, for I was naked." I want to make some kind of, I don't make disclaimers, but I want to kind of set the tone for the things that I'm going to say. I'm going to tell you, I never preached a sermon on shame. But that's superfluous to say that, because there's a lot of subjects I've never preached a sermon on. Shame is just one of them. But I want you to understand that everything that I am going to say today comes from my firm and strong belief in a biblical worldview, a Superman strong biblical worldview. All right? Now, with that said, because I'm going to say some things that might offend some people, or they might think I'm getting a little political here, but they all come from the background that I have a strong biblical worldview. What do you mean by that, preacher? This. I believe the Bible has something to say about how we live our life. I believe the Bible has some impact on how we conduct ourselves as citizens in God's world. And I'm not talking about just us as individuals. I'm talking about institutions. I'm talking about public institutions, governments. I'm talking about private institutions, corporations, and whatever else you may have. I believe that the Bible has an impact on how we conduct, or should, let me rephrase that the Bible should have an impact and should speak to us in our world. With that said, I want to start out with what the sage of Proverbs 11:2 has to say. When pride comes, then comes shame. But with the humble is wisdom. Right away, it's very obvious that the sage is comparing two groups of people. He's comparing those who are very proud. You know, they are so proud that they don't even walk on the ground. They walk on air, so to speak. You know, those kind of haughty, snotty-nosed kind of people that we don't deal with and won't deal with us. Those who consider themselves above us. Then there's that other class of people that I think fit the most of us. I like to think of myself in that kind of class. Humble people. People who live their lives who live a well-balanced life in relationship to their world, in relationship to their community, in relationship to each other. Now let me get you to understand something. Humility doesn't mean that you're a doormat for somebody else to walk on. Humility means, and is defined and best described, as I heard a pastor do it many, many years ago, strength under control. Then Isaiah speaks, "Instead of your shame, you shall have double honor. And instead of confusion, they shall rejoice in their portion. Therefore, in their land they shall possess double, everlasting joy shall be theirs. Now, the they that the prophet is speaking about are these exiles that are coming back from Babylonian captivity after 70 years of being there, and they're coming back to the promised land, coming back to Zion, coming back to Jerusalem, and things are going to be better. Now that was a shameful experience. Captivity was a shameful experience. It changed the Jewish people, the Israelites, God's precious treasure, forever. They were ashamed in the nations around them. It said to the nations around them, your God's not very strong. You see, the strength of a nation relied a whole lot on its God in this ancient world. It's like two little boys arguing in a sandlot. My daddy can whoop your daddy. You know, they get their daddy in a fight and he's not even there. He doesn't even know about it. You see, the idea here is my God is stronger than your God. That's why you're in captivity. But the prophet is telling them things are going to get better. They will have double honor. The nations will honor them more greatly. There'll be no confusion if there was before. You'll understand now. The confusion is past. Why did God let this happen to us? Well, they brought it on themselves, didn't it? The prophet's been telling them for 20 years. Straighten up, fly right, get your feet back on the road, get back connected to God, live in the covenant relationship that God set up with you. They didn't believe it. 20 years. They heard that message, nothing's going to happen, but then one day it did. It's like preachers. Preachers have been preaching forever. Christ is coming back. People say, well, I don't believe that. And then one day it's going to happen. It's going to happen when we leave. Amen. Now, I don't want to be here when Christ comes back. I really don't. I want to be in my mansion, playing my mandolin. I want to be in heaven with God. They will be in no confusion. They will be rejoicing in their portion, for they will possess double what they had before they went off to captivity. They will experience everlasting joy. That's the way it's going to be. Then over in Ephesians, Paul writes to the church, for it is shameful to speak of those things which are done by them in secret. Now, the them are those individuals who live in darkness. Because in verses, in those chapters, in that chapter 5, Paul talks about light and darkness. And we discussed that this morning in Sunday school class, light and darkness. If you're living outside of the presence of God, you're living in darkness. If you live in the presence of God, you're living in light. Now we're talking here in metaphorical terms, and we're talking about spiritually, not physically. We're not talking about physical darkness and physical light. We're talking about spiritual darkness and spiritual light. Remember this, folks. You're more than flesh and blood. There's something spiritual about you. You have a spiritual side. And then he goes on and talks about what are the things they're doing that is in secret that are so shameful. He gives us a whole catalog of them in the opening verses of this chapter. Fornication. Goes on all the time. Been going on for years and years and years and years. Uncleanness or covetousness. You know what? The Bible says thou shalt not covet, right? That's one of the commandments. Amen. And there's a way to get around that. Do you know that? I don't want what maybe you have if I like it. I want one like it. Amen. You see, then I can get around being covetous. Filthiness, coarse jesting, foolish talking. We haven't moved very far from this scripture right here. We haven't moved very far from this text. Now that brings me to my subject, shame. 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 In the Latin it's cumi. Cumi, cumi. Cue me on you. Shame on you. I don't know how you spell it, but that's how you pronounce it. As I said, I've never preached a sermon on shame, but then that's not a problem. I've not preached a sermon on a lot of subjects. And I've never heard a sermon on shame, to be perfectly honest with you. But I was researching this subject, and that if you go on the internet, man, you can just find anything. You know what? There's a whole host of sermons on shame. Several of them. I want to define shame for you as Merriam-Webster did in his 9th Collegiate Dictionary. It goes this way: a painful emotion caused by consciousness of guilt, shortcoming, or impropriety. I want to read that again. A painful emotion caused by consciousness of guilt, shortcoming, or impropriety. See, people who feel, who have a sense of shame should feel some kind of pain. It should prick their conscience, so to speak. I'm not talking about physical pain here. I'm talking about emotional pain. But emotional pain can be just as damaging to you as physical pain can do, because emotional pain brings stress. And let's face it, we're old folks. We don't need a lot of stress in our life. Amen. I apologize. Stress, our blood pressure goes up. Ulcers happen. We lose sleep. We either lose or gain weight because we lose weight because we worry and don't eat, or we worry and we just eat ourselves right out of our clothes. Shame can be hard to deal with. Very hard to deal with. Maybe we're not quite sure how to deal with it. I have some suggestions for you, or some options. We can sweep it under a mental rug in our mind and forget about it. We can be embarrassed by our shame and still do nothing about it. Or we can confess the fact that we feel shame, confess the cause of our shame, and devise a plan to deal with it. Now, that plan may require an apology to someone else. Never will forget when I was a kid, one of the most difficult things I had to do, my father made me do it. I don't remember how old I was. I had said something very nasty to an elderly woman. I loved this woman. Don't misunderstand me. I loved this woman. I wouldn't tell you her name, but you wouldn't know her. She's been going on to her reward years and years and years ago. Well, I don't remember what I even said, but my daddy knew about it. He heard about it, and he made me go and apologize to that lady, and he took me. Now, you think that was a difficult thing to do. I didn't want to do that under any circumstances, but I did. So we can apologize to an individual because we have done something which brings us shame in a way. And it may require us, as the old song says, to have a little talk with Jesus.
Yes.
Maybe. And as I said, we can always sleep and ignore it. Put it under a rug and forget about it. Now, what I'm saying here is simply this. Most of us who consider ourselves well-adjusted, normal individuals, when we feel shame, really feel shame, deep shame, shame that pains our conscience, shame that causes us to have sleeplessness, shame that takes away our appetite, then we have to deal with it. And we have to do something about it.
Bless the Lord.
Well, I thought about our secular, progressive world in that thought, in that vein. And I asked myself a question. Are we living in a world, are we living in a time when our society is shameless? Doesn't have any shame. Doesn't express any shame. Doesn't exhibit in any way, any fashion, any kind of shame. Well, as I listen to the newscast, as I watch people's behavior on television, which I try to avoid as much as I can, I think there's some element of truth in that point. We hear about athletes who've taken performance-enhancing drugs so they'll be a winner. Happens in many sports. Happens in basketball or baseball. It happened in baseball. It happens in a lot of sports. They want to be a champion. And we hear about public figures who lie about their military service when they wasn't even in the military. And then we hear about those people who were in the military, who got some kind of a medal or something or other, and then it's kind of suspicious. The grounds on which they got that medal may be kind of suspicious. Maybe they stretched the truth a little bit in order to get it. The attack on the embassy in Benghazi was reported to have been over a video that denigrated the Islamic religion. People were on the television saying that, all over the television. One individual went to 5 different television stations and made that same statement. But when the truth came out, it was a lie. And there was no shame, there was no repercussion. And 4 men lost their lives. They cried for help. And the people who could have helped them, who had time to help them, were told to stand down. Political figures openly lie in order to perpetuate their political position or their point of view, their stance on various issues. The news media has been so unreliable now that it is now called fake news, even by some of its own colleagues. And then, of course, there's the recent scandal that's been all over the television. You know all about it. Parents who were so eager to get their children in upscale universities that they were willing to pay money to ticker or tweak test scores, if you will. And we know one lady went to jail for a whole 14 days, only she served 11 and was free. There are others who are going to be held accountable. I don't know what degree, but there are many of them. And one child said to her parent when she found out what they had done, "Did you not have enough faith in me to rely on my ability to get into this college?" Now, everything I've mentioned here seems to occur without any sense of shame. Do you hear that? There's no sense of shame. There are no apologies. There are no repercussions, with the exception of some of these people. Some athletes have been called to task for their behavior. If their name appears in some record book of accomplishments, there's sometimes an asterisk placed by it, indicating that that record was not necessarily earned legitimately by their own natural talent. And we all, of course, have heard about the cyclist Lance Armstrong. You know, I always admired Lance Armstrong. He won 7 Tour de France's, but it came out that he had used performance-enhancing drugs. He was stripped of those titles. He was banned. He's been banned from the sport of cycling, maybe all sports, at least sport of cycling. And his accomplishments have been taken out of the 2000 volume of the Olympic record book. Now, he apologized for his actions. He really did. It was like the politician who lied about his service in Vietnam when he wasn't even there. He said, "I didn't intentionally to do it. It wasn't my intention to lie about it, then why do it?" Lawrence tried to apologize for his actions, but it just came to the point where it was obviously he couldn't do it anymore. And I have to wonder if Lawrence ever felt a sense of shame for what he did. Been said that 20% of the news media is atheistic. Just don't believe in God. And that other 80%, I don't know what the percentage is exactly, but a number of them are agnostic. Now, if you don't believe in God, you have no sense of accountability for your life, basically. You believe you can get away with anything. You're not going to be judged for it. We don't judge them. We don't hold them accountable. Now, an agnostic is an individual who kind of sits on the fence. They're not quite sure where God exists or doesn't exist. And the Bible says you can't be there. You got to be on one side or the other. You cannot serve as the body of Jesus. You can't serve God and mammon. You can't serve the devil and God at the same time. Paul gives us a pretty good description of a shameless society in the book of Ephesus. A shameless society, he says, is alienated from God because of its ignorance, its lack of sensitivity, its lack of spiritual insight, and the hardness of its heart. Callousness. A callous individual doesn't have any sensitivity. A callous individual can do anything and not feel any guilt about it. A callous individual is a shameless individual. A shameless society, he says to Timothy, speaks lies and hypocrisy, and its conscience is seared as with a hot iron. You ever been ironing something, you have an iron on it too long and it turns brown and you pick it up, there's a little hole in it too because you burn a hole in it.
Yeah.
By the way, I thought about irons. Have you ever used one of those old irons that didn't use electricity? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
You had to sit it on a cook stove to get it hot and then use it. You had to have 3 or 4 of them because they'd get cold and you had to have another one ready.
Telling your age.
They were just a triangular piece of iron. They're pretty heavy and had a handle on it, and you ironed your clothes. I've seen those. I never used one. I think my mother, I think, used one in the day. I never tried it. I want to suggest to you that shame is a watchman. I like the book of Ezekiel. I love the book of Ezekiel. It's written in a dialogical fashion, a conversation between the prophet and God. God speaks and the prophet listens, and the prophet responds. In the 3rd chapter, 17th verse, God said these words to the prophet, Son of man, I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. I thought about that. I didn't want to scare George, but I wanted to say, hallelujah, amen. I figured she'd come running in my office and wonder what happened to me.
Amen.
In the day that the prophet lived, and even over in the New Testament, let's go to the New Testament, farmers would have watchtowers out in their fields when the harvest was getting ripe and ready to take grapes, barley, whatever it might be. They put a watchman in the tower because they didn't want thieves coming in and stealing it. Cities in the day of the prophet had watchtowers. Watchtower might be over the main entrance of the gate. There might be 1 or 2, I don't know, but there's at least one right over the main entrance to the city. And up in that area, put a watchman. He'd be alert. Danger was coming. He would warn the city. I thought about that and I put that in the context of where we live right now. Every man that God calls, and see here the prophet says that God made him a watchman. There was no committee that met and said to him, Ezekiel, we think you'd make a good watchman. The elders didn't get together and says, we need a watchman, Ezekiel. How about filling that position? The prophet said God made him a watchman. A sense of call to that. You can't do ministry without a sense of call. If you do, you're a charlatan. And a minister, I thought, all of God's men that He's called in the ministry are watchmen. They're watchmen. They've come to warn those under their care about danger that is coming and how to prevent disaster from happening to them when they step into eternity. How to keep from going to hell and go to heaven. It was God's doing, not Ezekiel's. I submit to you that shame is a watchman. I read an account of a pastor who served in the Korean War. And he had this to say about his experience there. We thought nothing of winter maneuvers without tent stoves and road marches in our chemical suits and gas masks, he said. Physical training was demanding. I remember running past rice paddies at 0 dark 30. Then up a mountain, circling a Buddhist temple at the top, then running back down. And then he had this to say: after physical training, we needed physical therapy. He went on to say that he learned one thing from that infantry experience that he had in Korea. And he said, the Koreans as well as us shared the same tradition, a shame tradition. A shame tradition. You didn't want to bring shame to your unit, he said, or you'd be ostracized. In the Asian culture of Korea, individuals didn't want to bring shame to the family. And that applied to all Asian cultures. You'll know that in World War II, I was watching a documentary on, I think it was Iwo Jima, how difficult it was to capture Iwo Jima, and the general in charge of that sequestered into a cave that couldn't get to him. And when he lost the battle, he went out on a point and he committed harikari because he didn't want to bring shame to himself or to his emperor. Shame is a watchman. Shame is a watchman that holds us to a certain standard of conduct in our society. It says to us, be careful of your conduct. Be careful of your speech. Be careful how you treat other individuals. Be careful, because God is watching. And He'll hold you accountable.
Yes, He does.
Shame says this, as a watchman: wrap yourself in a mantle of decorum that all reasonable people would wear and find acceptable. And I don't think, sadly, that is happening in our secular, progressive society. Shame can be a barrier. It can be a barrier to God's grace.
Yes.
God's unmerited favor. And we ourselves set that barrier in place when we refuse to let go of the sin in our life because we just can't do it. Let me tell you something. You can't let go of sin by yourself. You cannot let go of sin by yourself. Try as hard as you might, you can't. Only God can forgive sin. Only the blood of Jesus Christ can erase sin from our life. And we need to remember the story Jesus told about the publican and the Pharisee. The publican said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And when we get to that place, we're in the right place that God can touch our lives. God can reach into our lives. God has that ability to get into our lives and get into those places in our life where you and I can't go.
Yes.
We can't earn our way there. I don't care how good you want to be. There's nothing wrong with being good. But goodness don't bring you salvation. See, we fail to remember one thing, I think sometimes. God's not in the condemning business. You've heard people say it, I've heard people say, man, I'm so mean, God could never save me. And I think they're bragging about that. They're bragging about how mean they can be. You see, I believe Ted Bundy was the was the clearest example of evil personified that comes to mind immediately. He killed I don't know how many women. He was a cruel, evil person. John Wayne Gacy, who killed all the people and buried them under his hand. You see, even God can forgive an evil individual like that. We want to, now, He's going to hold them accountable. God can hold us accountable. We'll be accountable for it. See, sin leaves scars on your life that you never forget. And like the Beatitude says, blessed are those who mourn. See, they're mourning because they look back over their life and they see their sin. And it causes them to mourn. I look back over my life and I see some things that I've done. I wish if I could go back, I'd never do them. They hurt me. I can't correct them. I can't solve them now. I wish I could. But we fail to remember that God is not in the condemning business. God's in the redeeming business.
Amen.
And His grace can break down the barriers of sin and guilt, resistance and stubbornness, and all the barriers that separate us from the grace and mercy of a saving God and eradicate them. In Colossians, Paul admonishes the Christians to walk worthy of the Lord. Well, that's a tough one.
Yes.
That sets the bar and the standard of living very high. The question is this: are any of us as Christians ashamed of the service that we render to God and His kingdom? If in some place in our life at some time, if we were confronted by God in some way, would we be ashamed? Would shame come washing over us like a flood tide? Does our life as Christian bring us shame or a sense of walking worthy with God? Sin in the life of a Christian has a tag along with it. It's called shame. Dare we say that if any one of us were to step before God or Jesus Christ in eternity, we would feel shame. Paul never had anywhere about that. Paul never feared about that. He didn't have to worry about shame. Because while Paul knew that when he drew his last breath, when he closed his eyes on this side of eternity and stepped through that veil over into the other side in the presence of God, he would hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant."
Praise the Lord.
Is that what you live to hear in your Christian life? We're going to stand and sing our hymn of commitment. Hymn number 307, Amazing Grace. And if you need to make some decision for God and His kingdom today, I encourage you to make it as we sing this hymn.
307. Just stand, please. Just sing this just as prayerfully as you can.